lot of beginners think that print and return are almost the same thing in Python, because technically both give us some kind of output. So to understand the difference between print and return, let's first create a very simple function. Now in Python, whenever we want to create a function, we use the def keyword. So we will create a function called addNumbers. Now this function will take two numbers as the parameters. Now parameters are basically variables that receive values when the function gets called. Now inside the function, we will use the print function to display the addition of both numbers. So currently, this function is taking two numbers, adding them, and printing the answer. So now below the function, let's call it. So we will call the addNumbers function and pass 5 and 3 as the arguments. And now as we run the program, we get the output as 8. Simple. But now watch carefully what happens when I try to store the result inside a variable, because this is where almost every beginner gets confused for the first time. So now I'll create a variable called result and store the function call in it. And now let's print the variable itself. Now before running the code, most beginners expect the output to be 8, because technically our function is adding the numbers. But when we run this, look carefully at the output. We first got 8 as the output, and then we also got none as the output. Now this looks extremely weird at first, because where did this none come from? Our function is clearly calculated 8, so why is Python saying none? And this is exactly where the real difference between print and return starts, because print and return are doing two completely different jobs internally. Print is only responsible for displaying something on the screen. That's it. It shows the value to the user, but it does not send the value back to the place where the function was called. And this is the important part most beginners miss. So when we wrote result equals addNumbers, Python expected the function to send back some value. But our function never sent anything back. It only displayed something on the screen using print. So internally, Python says, okay, since you didn't return anything, I'll store none. And that's why the variable result contains none, not 8, because print displays, but return sends data back. And these two things sound similar, but internally they're completely different concepts. So the next question naturally becomes, if print only displays the value, then how do we actually send the value back? And this is exactly where return comes into the picture. So let's slightly modify the same code. Now inside the function, instead of writing print num1 plus num2, I'm going to replace print with the return keyword. So now the function looks something like this. Now let's slow down for a second and properly understand what this line is actually doing internally. When Python reaches the return keyword, it immediately takes the value written after return and sends that value back to the place where the function was originally called. That means when Python sees the return statement, it first calculates the addition, so now this return statement looks something like this, and then it literally sends 8 back outside the function. Now because the value is being sent back, we can finally store it inside a variable properly. So now the line result equals addNumbers, internally it almost behaves like result equals 8, because the function call itself gets replaced with the returned value. So now if we print the result variable, the output becomes 8. And notice something very important this time. We're getting only one output, no none, because now the function is actually sending data back. And this is the biggest mental shift you need to make while learning functions. Print is for humans, and return is for the program. And this one line can completely change how you understand functions forever. Because when we use print, the value only becomes visible on the screen. But when we use return, the value becomes reusable. And reusable values are what real programming depends on. For example, imagine tomorrow you build a calculator app, or a machine learning model, or a Flask API, or maybe some automation script. In all these cases, you usually don't want functions to just display values. You want functions to give values back so the rest of the program can use them later. And this is why experienced programmers use return most of the time inside functions, while beginners overuse print everywhere. Now at this point, you may start thinking, okay, so does that mean we should never use print inside functions? And the answer is not exactly, because both print and return have their own purpose. The real problem only happens when we confuse their roles. So let's understand this with a slightly more realistic situation. Imagine we are creating a function that calculates the square of a number. So we'll create a function called square number, and it will take a number as a parameter. Now, inside the function, we will calculate the square by multiplying the number by itself. But currently, this line alone does nothing, because Python calculates the value and then immediately forgets it. So now we have two choices. Either we display the value using print, or we send the value back using return. And this is where the behavior completely changes. First, let's use print. So inside the function, we will use the print function to display the square of a number as output. So now let's call the square function and pass 4 as the argument. So now as we run the program, we get 16 as the output. Again, everything looks fine. But now let's imagine we want to do something more useful with this value. Suppose after calculating the square, we want to multiply the result by 10. So now most beginners try something like this. Create a variable called final value and set it equal to the result multiplied by 10, and then print the final value. So now, as we run the program, we get the type error as output. Now, this happens because our function only printed the value. It never returned it. So internally, the result equals square number becomes result equals none. And now Python is trying to do none multiplied by 10, which obviously makes no sense. And this is why the program fails. Now watch what happens when we replace print with return. Now the function is no longer just displaying the value, it is sending the value back to the program. So now this line internally becomes this. So now when we run the program, we get 160 as the output. And this is the real power of return. It allows the output of one function to become the input of another part of the program, which means functions can now work together. Now, there's another super important thing about return that beginners usually discover accidentally, and the first time they see it, it feels almost like Python ignored part of their code. Let me show you what I mean. Suppose we create a simple function called checkNumber. Now imagine inside this function we want to do multiple things. First, maybe we want to print something, then return a value, then maybe print another line after that. So first, let's print a simple message. So I'll write print checking the number, and then I return the num. And after the return statement, let's write one more print statement. And now let's call the function. Now, before running the code, many beginners think all 3 lines inside the function will execute one by one, because technically they are written inside the function. But watch the output carefully. The moment we run the program, we get checking the number as output. That's it. The last print statement never runs. And this is another huge behavior of return. The moment Python sees return, the function immediately stops executing. So when Python reaches return num, it does 2 things together. First, it sends the value back, and second, it exits the function completely, which means any code written after return in the same block becomes unreachable. Python will never execute it. And this is why experienced programmers are very careful about where they place the return statement, because wherever return happens, the function ends there itself. In fact, you can almost think of return as take this value and leave the function immediately. And honestly, understanding this behavior is extremely important later in programming, because in real projects, developers often use return to stop execution early. Like if a password is wrong, return immediately. If data is invalid, return immediately. If a condition fails, return immediately. So return is not just about giving back values, it also controls the flow of the function itself. And this is why return is much more powerful than beginners initially think. Now, there's one final thing beginners should understand. A function can return literally anything, not just numbers, not just text, almost anything in Python. Suppose we create a function that stores information about a student. So we'll create a function called studentData, and we pass name and marks as the parameters. Now, instead of returning just a name or marks, let's return a dictionary. So inside the function, we write a return statement that returns a dictionary containing the names and marks of the students. So now let's call the function and pass Mike as the name argument and 90 as the marks argument, and then store this function call to a student variable. So internally, this student variable becomes something like this. And now, because the function returned the data properly, we can access individual values from it. So if we print the student's name, then on running the program, we get Mike as the output. And if we print the student's marks, then we get 90 as the output. Now imagine trying to do all this with only print.
it would become extremely messy because printed values are not reusable structures. Returned values are. And honestly, this is why return is everywhere in professional programming. Whether you learn web development, machine learning, automation, data science, APIs, game development, everywhere, functions mainly communicate using returned values. In fact, most of the time when developers create functions, they don't even care about displaying anything on the screen. They care about what value is this function giving back, because that returned value becomes part of a bigger system. And now, finally, you can probably see the entire difference clearly. Print says, hey human, look at this, while return says, hey program, use this. And both are useful, but for completely different reasons. So yeah, that's the real difference between print and return in Python functions. Print is mainly used when we simply want to display something on the screen for the user, while return is used when we want to send a value back so the rest of the program can actually use it later. And honestly, this may look like a very small difference in the beginning, but this single concept completely changes how you write functions in Python, because beginners usually write functions that only show outputs, while real-world programming mostly depends on functions that return reusable values. Alright, so that's it for this video. If this video helped you finally understand the real difference between print and return in Python, then make sure to hit the like button. And if you're interested in learning Python in this kind of detailed and beginner-friendly way, then definitely subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.